The sun, a pale and indifferent disk, struggled briefly above the jagged horizon of the fjord, casting long skeletal shadows across the frozen earth. This was dawn in the Viking Age, not a gentle awakening, but a reluctant surrender to another day of relentless toil and bone-chilling cold. Imagine, if you will, stepping from the relative warmth of your bed, not into a heated home, but into a dim, smoky longhouse where the air hung thick with the smell of damp wool, wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and the ever-present tang of salt and fish. The floor beneath your feet, if you were fortunate, might be packed earth covered in rushes. If not, it was simply frozen mud. This was the reality, the unglamorous, grinding start to existence for the vast majority of people living in Scandinavia during the early Middle Ages, roughly from the late 8th to the mid-11th century. Forget the romanticized images of horned helmets and roaring feasts. The true Viking life was a brutal, unforgiving marathon where survival was the only prize, and comfort was a luxury almost entirely unknown. You, accustomed to central heating, readily available food, and modern medicine, would not last a single day. Let us begin, then, at the beginning, with the cold, hard ground itself. The land was the first adversary. Scandinavia, modern-day Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, was and remains a region of stark contrasts and formidable challenges. Long, deeply indented coastlines were battered by the cold, treacherous waters of the North Sea and the Norwegian Sea. Inland, dense, dark forests stretched for miles, filled with wolves, bears, and the constant threat of getting lost. Mountains, jagged and often snow-capped even in summer, dominated landscapes, making travel arduous and dangerous. And the climate. Ah, the climate. Winters were not merely cold, they were a siege. Temperatures plummeted far below freezing for months on end. Snow fell deep and heavy, burying settlements, cutting off travel, and making the simple act of gathering firewood a life-threatening expedition. Wind, howling down from the Arctic or sweeping across the open sea, carried a bite that could freeze exposed skin in minutes. Summers, while milder, were short and often damp and cool, offering only a brief respite before the long slide back into winter's icy grip. Frost could occur even in midsummer nights. This environment shaped everything about Viking life: their architecture, their agriculture, their technology, their mindset, and their constant, gnawing hunger. Hunger was a companion, always lurking at the edge of consciousness. Consider the longhouse, the center of Viking domestic life. It was not a cozy cottage. It was a long, rectangular structure, typically built from sturdy timber frames filled with wattle and daub, woven sticks plastered with mud and dung, or sometimes turf. Roofs were thickly thatched with reeds or covered in sod for insulation. Yet they were rarely entirely waterproof. Smoke from the central hearth, the only source of heat and light, had to escape through a hole in the roof, meaning the interior was perpetually dim and smoky. Your eyes would sting constantly. There were no chimneys. There were no windows, or perhaps only small, unglazed openings covered with shutters or animal hides, letting in minimal light but plenty of cold air. The longhouse was essentially one large room, often partitioned only loosely. At one end might be a byre for livestock, cattle, sheep, goats, whose body heat provided some extra warmth, but whose smells and sounds were ever present. The floor was hard-packed earth. Imagine the damp seeping into your bones as you tried to sleep on a simple straw pallet or a wooden bench covered in furs, surrounded by the snores, coughs, and restless movements of your entire extended family. Grandparents, parents, siblings, cousins, perhaps even servants or thralls, all sharing this single, smoky, crowded space. Privacy was an unimaginable luxury. Hygiene was rudimentary at best. Washing meant a quick dip in an icy stream or a wipe down with a cloth in cold water, if water could be fetched without freezing. Soap was rare and harsh. Lice were a constant, itching torment. Disease spread easily in these cramped conditions. A simple cold could become pneumonia. A cut could fester into a fatal infection. You, with your sanitized home and hot showers, would recoil in horror from the sheer, unrelenting grit and grime of daily existence. Beyond the farmstead walls, the forest and sea offered resources, but demanded respect and courage. Men would venture into the dense woods to hunt deer, elk, or boar for meat and hides, or to fell timber for building, fuel, or shipbuilding. Hunting was not a sport. It was a necessity fraught with danger. A wounded boar could kill a man. Getting lost in the trackless forest meant almost certain death from exposure or predators. The sea was an even more formidable presence. Fishing was vital for protein and food security. Men would take small boats out into the fjords or coastal waters, battling waves, wind, and cold to catch cod, herring, or salmon using lines, nets, or traps. A sudden storm could capsize their vessel, drowning them in the icy water. Drowning was a common and feared death. The sea gave life, but it took it away with terrifying ease. This proximity to danger, this constant awareness of the fragility of existence, was woven into the fabric of Viking consciousness. They lived with death as a close neighbor, not a distant fear. You, shielded from such immediate physical dangers by modern infrastructure and technology, would find this constant low-level terror and the necessity of facing it daily utterly overwhelming. And what of the thralls? Slavery was an integral part of Viking society. Captured in raids, bought and traded, or born into bondage, thralls formed the lowest class. They performed the hardest, dirtiest, most degrading work. Digging ditches, mucking out byres, hauling heavy loads, working in the fields under the harshest conditions. They had no rights, no property, no legal protection. They could be beaten, sold, or even killed at their owner's whim. Their lives were even more precarious and miserable than those of free farmers. They slept in the darkest, coldest corners of the longhouse. They wore the coarsest clothing. They ate the scraps. Their existence was one of pure, unrelenting exploitation and suffering. You, living in a world where slavery is, at least officially, abolished and human rights are enshrined, would find the casual brutality and utter dehumanization of thrall life morally repugnant and psychologically devastating to witness, let alone endure. So, the day began. Cold, dark, smoky, filled with the sounds of grunting livestock, the scrape of tools, the groan of wood, the coughing of crowded humanity, and the ever-present howl of the wind outside. Every movement required effort against the cold and the weight of exhaustion left over from yesterday. Every task was a battle against the elements, against scarcity, against the sheer physical limitations of the human body. There was no comfort, no ease, no promise of relief. This was just the foundation, the baseline reality upon which the rest of Viking life was built. It was a life defined by hardship, shaped by necessity, and endured because there was no alternative. To survive even this first day, you would need reserves of physical strength, mental fortitude, and sheer bloody-minded persistence that you almost certainly do not possess. The Viking dawn was not a beginning. It was a continuation of a struggle that had no end in sight. And this was only the start. The true tests, the voyages, the raids, the battles, the constant threat of violence, these lay ahead, layered upon this already crushing foundation of daily misery. You wouldn't survive a day? You wouldn't survive the first hour. But the day, relentless and unforgiving, had only just begun. And then there was the work. From the moment the pale light filtered through the smoke hole, work began. There was no weekend, no holiday, no concept of leisure as we know it. Survival demanded constant labor. For the men, this meant tending to the land, such as it was. Farming in Scandinavia was incredibly difficult. The growing season was short, the soil often thin and rocky, especially in Norway and Sweden. Clearing land for crops meant back-breaking effort, felling massive trees with iron axes that dulled quickly, digging out stubborn stumps, hauling rocks to create rudimentary field boundaries. The primary crops were hardy grains like barley, rye, and oats, not the soft wheat of bread, but tough grains used for porridge, flatbread, and brewing ale. Plowing was done with wooden plows tipped with iron, pulled by oxen or sometimes by the farmers themselves. It was slow, exhausting work, often done on cold, wet ground. Sowing, weeding, and harvesting all had to be crammed into the few short months when the land was unfrozen or snow-covered. A single bad harvest, a late frost, a summer drought, or an early snow could mean the difference between scraping through the winter and starving to death. Hunger was a real, terrifying possibility every single year. For the women, the work was equally relentless and started even earlier. Before the men were fully awake, the women would be stirring the embers of the central hearth back to life, coaxing warmth into the frigid air. They would draw water from a well or a nearby stream, a task involving heavy buckets carried over slippery, frozen ground. Water was needed for cooking, cleaning, and for the livestock. Then came the preparation of the morning meal, usually a thick porridge made from yesterday's grains, perhaps supplemented by a little dried fish or sour milk if available. Cooking meant managing the open fire, constantly adjusting logs, shielding pots from sparks, enduring the heat and smoke on your face while your back froze. After the meal, the real work began. Women were responsible for processing almost everything the household consumed. Milk from cows or goats had to be churned into butter or cheese, a laborious process requiring hours of constant stirring or pressing. Grain had to be ground into flour using heavy corn stones, back-breaking rotary grinding that took immense physical strength. Wool from sheep had to be washed, carded, teased, and straightened with iron combs, spun into thread using drop spindles, and then woven into cloth on upright looms. This wasn't a relaxing hobby. It was essential production. Every thread of clothing, every blanket, every sail for a ship depended on the women's endless spinning and weaving. They also tended vegetable gardens, onions, leeks, peas, beans, preserved food by smoking, salting, or drying it for the winter, cared for children, made and repaired clothing and tools, brewed ale, and treated the sick with herbal remedies. Their day stretched from before dawn until long after dusk, a relentless cycle of physical labor with no respite. You, with your supermarkets, washing machines, and modern appliances, cannot comprehend the sheer, unending physical drudgery required just to maintain the most basic level of subsistence. Children were not exempt from this world of toil. From a very young age, as soon as they could walk and understand instructions, they were put to work. Boys might be tasked with herding sheep or goats, a job that meant enduring all weather, watching for predators, and preventing the animals from wandering into forests or bogs. They would learn to use small tools, help with fetching firewood or water, and assist the men in the fields. Girls would learn the skills of women, spinning, weaving, cooking, caring for younger siblings. They would help with churning, grinding grain, and tending the fire. Education was practical, not academic. They learned by doing, by observing, and by being corrected, often harshly. Play was a brief interlude stolen between chores, if energy allowed. Childhood, as a protected time of innocence and learning, simply did not exist. Life was too hard, too precarious. Every pair of hands was needed for survival. You, who likely had a childhood filled with school, play, and relative safety, would find the constant demands and responsibilities placed on Viking children shocking and oppressive. The pale, weak light of the Scandinavian sun, having briefly acknowledged the day, now began its slow, indifferent retreat. But for the Vikings, work did not cease with the fading light. It merely shifted its focus, driven by the unyielding demands of survival. The morning's tasks, tending the fire, fetching water, preparing the meager porridge. The first foray into the fields or woods, or merely the opening salvo in a day-long war against hunger, cold, and decay. The concept of a lunch break was as foreign as a tropical beach. Sustenance was a constant concern, a low-grade anxiety that gnawed at the belly as persistently as the cold gnawed at the fingers and toes. Let us delve deeper into the relentless grind of acquiring, preparing, and preserving the necessities of life, a grind that would break the spirit and body of anyone unaccustomed to such perpetual hardship. Food was the primary preoccupation. The Viking diet was monotonous, coarse, and often scarce. It was dictated entirely by the harsh climate and the short growing season. Barley was the cornerstone. Barley porridge, thick, lumpy, and cooked in water, or sometimes milk, was the staple breakfast, lunch, and dinner for most. It provided calories but little excitement. Barley was also ground into flour for flatbread, dense, hard, unleavened discs cooked on hot stones or in the ashes of the fire. This bread was tough, often gritty, and could break teeth if not softened in stew or ale. Oats and rye were also grown and used similarly. Wheat was a rare luxury, suitable only for the very wealthy or for special occasions. Vegetables added some variety, but only hardy, fast-growing kinds. Onions, leeks, cabbages, peas, beans, and turnips. These were boiled into pottages, thick soups that might also contain bits of salted meat or fish, if available. Fresh greens were a fleeting summer treat. Fruits were even rarer, perhaps some wild berries gathered in late summer, quickly eaten or dried. Sugar was unknown. Honey was a precious commodity, used sparingly for brewing mead or as a rare treat. Spices were virtually non-existent. Flavor came from salt, smoke, and perhaps some wild herbs like juniper or angelica. You, accustomed to a dizzying array of fresh produce, exotic spices, and sweet treats, would find the Viking diet profoundly unappetizing, nutritionally limited, and deeply unsatisfying. The constant, gnawing hunger, even after a meal, would be a new and miserable experience. Protein came from livestock and the sea, but its availability fluctuated wildly. Cattle were highly valued, not just for meat but for milk, labor, pulling plows, and as a measure of wealth. Slaughtering a cow was a major decision, usually reserved for late autumn, before the winter feed ran out, or for a large feast. The meat would then be salted heavily, or smoked to preserve it through the winter. Salt was crucial and expensive, often obtained by evaporating seawater in large iron pans over fires, another laborious process. Sheep and goats were more common sources of meat and milk. Pigs were easier to raise, foraging in the woods, and provided pork and bacon, which could also be smoked. Chickens provided eggs and occasional meat. But all these animals required constant care, feeding in winter when forage was scarce, protection from predators, milking, shearing for sheep, mucking out buyers. The smell of manure and damp animals was a permanent feature of the longhouse interior. You, who buy meat neatly packaged in a refrigerated supermarket, would find the daily reality of caring for, slaughtering, butchering, and preserving animals, the blood, the guts, the flies, the stench, utterly revolting and physically demanding. The sea was arguably the most important source of protein. Fish, especially cod and herring, were dietary mainstays. Fishing was a year-round activity, but it became particularly crucial in late winter and early spring, when stored food was running low and new crops weren't ready. Men would brave freezing temperatures and rough seas in small, open boats. They fished with lines baited with shellfish or small fish, or with nets that had to be mended constantly. A large catch was a cause for relief, not celebration, because then the real work began: gutting, cleaning, and preserving the fish. Some might be eaten fresh, a rare luxury, but most had to be saved. Cod was split open, salted heavily, and laid out on racks to dry in the wind and sun, if available, or near the smoking fire. This created stockfish, hard as wood, which could be stored for years. Before eating, it had to be beaten for hours to soften it, and then soaked in water to rehydrate and remove some salt. Herring were often fermented or salted in barrels, creating an intensely pungent food. Shellfish like mussels and oysters were gathered from the shores, another cold, wet, finger-numbing task. Whales and seals were hunted when possible, providing massive amounts of meat. Blubber for oil, used for light and lubrication, and skins. But whaling was extremely dangerous, undertaken in small boats by men hurling spears at gigantic, powerful creatures. A single thrash of a whale's tail could shatter a boat and drown its crew. The sea gave generously, but it exacted a heavy price in courage, skill, and often, lives. You, who perhaps order fish at a restaurant, would find the reality of procuring it. The cold, the danger, the gore, the sheer physical effort of handling tons of slippery, smelly fish completely beyond your capacity. Preservation was the key to surviving the long winter. Without refrigeration, every method available was employed, and each was labor-intensive. Salting required vast quantities of salt. Smoking meant maintaining a smoky fire for days or weeks, constantly tending it to ensure the food dried without cooking or burning. Drying relied on dry air and wind, which were unreliable in damp Scandinavia. Food could easily spoil, becoming moldy, maggot-infested, or rancid. Eating spoiled food was a constant risk, leading to debilitating stomach illnesses or worse. Storing food was also a challenge. Underground pits lined with wood or stone were used for root vegetables and grain, but they could flood or freeze. Smoked fish and meat hung from rafters in the longhouse, adding to the smoky atmosphere, but vulnerable to rats and mice, which were relentless pests. Ceramic pots, wooden barrels, and leather bags were used for storing salted foods, butter, and liquids, but none were perfectly airtight. The constant battle against rot, pests, and spoilage was another layer of anxiety and work. You, who throw away food past its best before date without a second thought, would find the Viking approach to food, the constant vigilance, the acceptance of imperfection, the necessity of eating things that were borderline edible, deeply unsettling and unhygienic. Shelter, the longhouse, while providing basic protection, was itself a source of constant labor and discomfort. Maintaining the structure was an endless task. The thatched roof needed regular repair. Reeds rotted, birds nested in it, and heavy snow could cause it to collapse. Turf roofs required weeding and patching. Wooden frames warped, cracked, or rotted over time, especially in the damp conditions. Wattle and daub walls needed constant patching as the mud cracked and fell away. Drafts were a perpetual problem, whistling through gaps in the walls or around doors. Doors were simple wooden slabs, often warped and ill-fitting, offering little resistance to the wind. Keeping the central hearth burning was a major occupation. It required a constant supply of firewood. Gathering wood meant venturing into the forest, felling trees, splitting logs, and hauling them back, heavy, dangerous work in all weather. In deep snow, this became a monumental effort. Managing the fire itself was a skill, keeping it hot enough for cooking and warmth, but not so large that it burned out of control or consumed fuel too quickly. Sparks were a constant hazard. A stray ember could easily ignite the dry thatch or wooden walls, turning the longhouse into an inferno. Fire was life, but it was also a deadly threat. The smoke, while providing some protection from insects, irritated the eyes and lungs. Soot covered everything. You, who adjust your thermostat with a finger, would find the relentless physical and dangerous chore of simply staying warm and maintaining your shelter utterly exhausting and fraught with risk. Clothing was another area of relentless toil and discomfort. Vikings wore layers of wool and linen. Linen, made from flax, was cooler and worn next to the skin in summer or as undergarments in winter. Wool provided essential warmth. But producing this clothing was an epic undertaking, falling almost entirely to women. Flax had to be retted, soaked in water to rot the outer stalks, then beaten and combed to extract the fibers, which were then spun into thread. Wool had to be sheared from sheep, using sharp shears or knives, a risky job. Washed, carded, teased apart with iron combs to align the fibers, and then spun. Spinning was done constantly, whenever a woman had a free moment, using a weighted drop spindle. It took hours of spinning to produce enough thread for even a small piece of cloth. Weaving the thread into fabric on an upright loom was also slow, physically demanding work. Dyeing the cloth was possible using plants, like woad for blue, madder for red, or weld for yellow. But it was an extra, time-consuming step, so most clothing remained the natural colors of wool, creams, browns, grays, or linen, off-white. Sewing the fabric into tunics, trousers, dresses, cloaks, and stockings was done with bone or iron needles, and linen or sinew thread. Every stitch was sewn by hand. Clothes were mended and patched until they literally fell apart. They were rarely washed thoroughly, so they became stiff with dirt, sweat, and smoke. Lice infested the seams. Cloaks, essential for warmth outdoors, were heavy, often felted wool, and could become waterlogged and freezing in rain or snow. Shoes were simple turn shoes made from a single piece of leather, stitched together with sinew. They offered minimal protection from cold, wet, or rough ground and wore out quickly, requiring constant repair or replacement. You, with your wardrobe of easy care, machine-washable clothes in countless styles and colors, would find the Viking approach to clothing, the endless, back-breaking labor of production, the discomfort, the dirt, the lice, the constant need for repair, intolerable. The sheer weight and scratchiness of woolen garments alone would be a constant irritation. Hygiene and health were constant battles. As mentioned, washing was a luxury. People might splash their face and hands with cold water, or take a quick dip in an icy stream or lake, a terrifying prospect in winter, but full-body bathing was rare, perhaps reserved for Saturday night in preparation for Sunday, if they were Christian, or before a festival. Soap, made from animal fat and wood, ash, lye, was harsh and drying. Teeth cleaning involved rubbing them with a chewed stick or using a rough cloth. Dental problems were common and agonizing, with no effective treatment. Lice, fleas, and other parasites were ubiquitous, causing constant itching and sometimes spreading diseases like typhus. Skin conditions like eczema or fungal infections were common and difficult to treat. Medical knowledge was limited, based on folklore, herbal remedies, and often dangerous practices like bloodletting or cauterization. Wounds were cleaned with water or urine, thought to be sterile, and stitched with sinew or thread. Infection was a constant and deadly threat. A simple cut could lead to blood poisoning and death. Broken bones were roughly set, often leaving the victim crippled. Childbirth was extremely dangerous for both mother and child. Maternal mortality rates were high. Infant mortality was staggering. It's estimated that as many as half of all children died before the age of 5, from disease, malnutrition, or accidents. Diseases we now vaccinate against, measles, smallpox, diphtheria, swept through communities like wildfire, killing indiscriminately. Life expectancy at birth was perhaps only 35 to 40 years, though if you survived childhood, you might live into your 50s or 60s. But life was hard, and bodies wore out quickly from constant labor, poor nutrition, and disease. You, with access to clean water, soap, antibiotics, vaccines, and modern surgery, would find the Viking world as approach to health and hygiene horrifyingly primitive, and the constant presence of debilitating illness and premature death terrifying. The sheer vulnerability of the human body in that environment is something your sanitized existence has shielded you from. And so the day wore on. The sun sank lower, casting longer shadows. The air grew colder. The fire needed more wood. The evening meal needed preparing. More porridge, perhaps some salted fish rehydrated and cooked, maybe a bit of dried meat if available. The tools used during the day, axes, knives, hoes, needed cleaning and sharpening. The livestock needed securing for the night. Children needed tending. Mending needed doing. A torn cloak, a broken harness, a cracked pot. Spinning and weaving continued by the flickering firelight. As long as eyes could focus and fingers could move. There was no television, no radio, no books for the common person. Entertainment was storytelling, singing, or simple games, but only after the essential work was done. Fatigue was a constant companion, a deep, bone-weary tiredness that sleep never fully seemed to banish. The longhouse filled with the sounds of the end of day, the crackle of the fire, the low murmur of conversation, the snores of the exhausted, the restless stirring of animals, the sigh of the wind finding its way through the walls. It was a life of unending repetition, of small victories against the elements, of constant, low-grade suffering punctuated by moments of real terror or grief. This was the baseline reality, the relentless grind of simply existing. You, with your comfortable home, your abundant food, your modern conveniences, your relative safety from disease and violence, would find this existence soul-crushingly bleak and physically impossible to sustain. You wouldn't survive a day. You wouldn't survive the relentless, monotonous, back-breaking grind of a single Viking afternoon. But the grind continued, day after day, season after season, a testament to human endurance, but a life you could not endure. The true Viking, the raider, the explorer, the warrior, emerged from this foundation of hardship, forged in the crucible of constant struggle. But that is a story for another part of this long, dark night. For now, the fire burns low, the shadows deepen, and the weight of survival presses down, heavy and unyielding. Sleep comes not as a rest, but as a brief escape from the toil that will begin anew with the next reluctant dawn. The relentless grind of daily survival, the cold, the hunger, the endless labor, formed the bedrock of Viking existence. But it was not the whole story. Woven into this fabric of hardship was another, more dynamic and terrifying thread. The life of the raider, the trader, the warrior. This is the aspect that captures the modern imagination. The image of the dragon ship bursting from the sea mist, the fierce warrior wielding an axe. Yet even this life, seemingly more adventurous, was built upon the same foundation of hardship and brutality, amplified by the constant threat of violent death. You who live in a society where violence is mostly contained by laws and distance, cannot comprehend the omnipresence of physical danger in the Viking world, nor the sheer physical and psychological toll of their warfare and exploration. Let us now turn to the forging of steel, both literal and metaphorical. That defined the Viking beyond their farmceads dot, the motivation for leaving the familiar, albeit harsh, shores of Scandinavia was complex, but rooted deeply in the realities we've already explored. Population pressure on limited fertile land, the desire for wealth in the form of silver, slaves, and luxury goods unobtainable at home, the thirst for adventure and fame, and perhaps even a push factor of political instability in some regions, all played a role. But whatever the reason, the act of going Viking, to go on an expedition, usually by sea, for raiding or trading, was a massive undertaking fraught with peril from the very start. It began with the ship. The Viking longship was a marvel of early medieval engineering, but building one was an immense communal effort requiring immense skill and resources. These ships were not casually constructed. They were built by specialized shipwrights using tools that were primitive by our standards. Axes, adzes, draw knives, augers, and chisels, all made of iron. The wood, primarily oak for the keel, and planks, pine for masts and spars, had to be felled, shaped, and seasoned. The planks were split radially from the log to maximize strength and flexibility, then overlapped, clinker-built, and riveted together with iron nails. The entire structure was flexible, allowing it to ride the waves rather than fight them, but this required incredibly precise joinery. Building a large warship could take months, even years, consuming vast quantities of timber and iron. It was a major investment for a community or a powerful chieftain. You, who see ships as common transportation, cannot grasp the sheer scale of effort, the specialized knowledge, and the communal resources required just to create the means of leaving. The ship was life, but building it was another layer of brutal labor. Once built, the ship needed a crew. Recruiting warriors and sailors wasn't like signing up for a job. It was a matter of kinship, loyalty to a chieftain, and the promise of plunder. The crew was a tight-knit, brutal brotherhood. Life aboard ship, even before reaching enemy shores, was harsh. The ship was open, offering little protection from the elements. Sailing meant exposure to wind, rain, freezing spray, and fire. Scorching sun. There was no cabin, no galley. Men slept on deck, perhaps under a makeshift tent of sailcloth, huddled together for warmth. Food was basic. Dried fish, hardtack, a very hard biscuit, perhaps some salted meat, and water or sour ale. Cooking was impossible on the open deck. A fire was too dangerous. Sanitation was non-existent. Waste went over the side. Storms were terrifying. A sudden gale could capsize the ship, drown the crew, or smash it against rocks. Navigation was done by observing the sun, stars, wind direction, wave patterns, the flight of birds, and landmarks. It was an intuitive art, passed down through generations, but prone to error in fog or unfamiliar waters. Getting lost meant death. At sea, the physical toll of sailing, the constant motion, the exposure, the cramped conditions, the need to row for hours when the wind failed, was immense. Blistered hands, raw backsides from sitting on hard thwarts, exhaustion, and seasickness were constant companions. You, who might get queasy on a ferry ride, would find the reality of a North Sea crossing in an open longship a nightmare of discomfort and mortal danger. The journey itself was a trial by fire and water. Then came the raid. This is the image, seared into popular culture. The dragon ship sliding silently up a river at dawn. The warriors leaping onto the shore. The sudden, brutal attack on a monastery or village. The reality was likely less silent and more chaotic, but the violence was undeniable. Monasteries were prime targets because they were poorly defended and housed wealth in the form of gold and silver chalices, crucifixes, illuminated manuscripts, and stored food. Villages were targeted for livestock, grain, tools, and people to be taken as slaves. The raid was swift, brutal, and terrifying for the victims. The Vikings used their mobility and ferocity to overwhelm local defenses before. Effective resistance could be organized. Their weapons, the broadaxe, the sword, the spear, the seeks, a large knife, and the bow and arrow were designed for close quarters carnage. They wore simple armor, a thick woolen tunic, perhaps a leather jerkin, and if wealthy, a mail. Hauberk, a shirt of interlocking iron rings, and an iron helmet, not horned. A wooden shield, often painted and rimmed with iron, was essential defense. Combat was horrific. It wasn't the choreographed duels of movies. It was a screaming, hacking, stabbing melee in a confined space. Shields splintered under axe blows. Swords, precious and difficult to make, broke on bone or armor. Arrows thudded into flesh. Men tripped and were trampled. The noise was deafening. The clash of steel, the screams of the wounded and dying, the roar of the attackers, the cries of the victims. Blood soaked the ground. The air filled with the stench of gore, sweat, and fear. Wounds were brutal. Severed limbs, deep gashes, punctured lungs, shattered bones. Death was often messy and agonizing. There was no battlefield medicine beyond the most basic bandaging. A serious wound meant a slow, painful death from infection or blood loss. The psychological toll of inflicting such violence and witnessing it must have been immense. Desensitization was a survival mechanism. The goal was plunder, not prolonged battle. They struck fast, took what they could carry, precious metals, food, livestock, slaves, and fled before a larger military force could arrive. You, who have likely never witnessed real violence beyond the screen, who live in a world where physical safety is largely assumed, would be utterly shattered by the visceral horror of a Viking raid. The sight of a man cleaved open by an axe, the sound of a woman screaming as her children are dragged away into slavery, the smell of blood and bowel. These are things your mind cannot truly comprehend without experiencing them, and experiencing them would likely break you. The Vikings were capable of this brutality because their world was brutal. Life was cheap, and survival often demanded it. But raiding was only one facet of Viking seafaring. They were also traders, establishing extensive trade networks that stretched from Constantinople, Istanbul, in the east to Newfoundland in the west. Trading expeditions shared many of the hardships of raiding voyages, the perilous sea crossings, the exposure, the cramped conditions, the risk of shipwreck. However, the goals were different. Instead of plunder, they sought goods, furs, amber, walrus ivory, and slaves from the north, silver, silk, spices, glass, and wine from the south and east. Trading centers like Hedeby in Denmark, Birka in Sweden, and later York in England became bustling hubs where goods from across the known world exchanged hands. Trading required different skills: negotiation, knowledge of languages and customs, the ability to assess the value of diverse goods. It was still dangerous. Trade routes could be ambushed by rivals or bandits. Local rulers might demand exorbitant tolls or simply seize the goods. Disputes over prices or quality could turn violent. A trader needed to be as tough and wary as a raider. The goods themselves were often obtained through questionable means: the furs and ivory from hunted animals in harsh climates, the slaves captured in raids. Even trade was built upon a foundation of exploitation and risk. You, who shop in comfortable malls or online, cannot grasp the physical danger, the uncertainty, and the morally ambiguous nature of long-distance trade in the Viking Age. A simple trading mission could end in shipwreck, robbery, enslavement, or violent death. In a foreign land, exploration was another dimension, driven perhaps by curiosity, the search for new land or resources, or simply being blown off course. The Vikings were the first Europeans to knowingly reach North America, establishing a short-lived settlement. At Lonso Meadows in Newfoundland, around 1000 AD, they explored the rivers of Russia, reaching the Caspian and Black Seas, and even serving as elite mercenaries for the Byzantine emperors, the Varangian Guard. They settled Iceland, Greenland, and parts of Britain, Ireland, France, Normandy, and Russia. Each of these ventures involved incredible hardship. Sailing into utterly unknown waters, facing unfamiliar climates, encountering potentially hostile native peoples like the Scrawlings in North America, and trying to establish a foothold in a strange land required immense courage, resilience, and adaptability. The Greenland settlement, for example, struggled for centuries with a marginal climate, eventually failing likely due to a combination of climate cooling, the Little Ice Age, soil exhaustion, conflict with the Inuit, and isolation. The cost of exploration was often high in lives lost. You, who can explore the world virtually, or with relative ease and safety, cannot fathom the courage and desperation it took to sail a small wooden ship into the vast, unknown Atlantic, knowing you might never return. A psychological burden of facing the absolute unknown, with no hope of rescue if things went wrong, is something your modern world has largely eliminated. The life of the raider, trader, or explorer was not an escape from the hardships of the farm. It was an amplification of them, layered with extreme danger and violence. It demanded peak physical condition. Warriors trained constantly with their weapons, practicing sword strokes, axe blows, spear thrusts, shield maneuvers. Strength and stamina were essential for rowing, fighting, hauling loot, and simply enduring the privations of the voyage. Enduring pain was a necessity. A warrior had to fight through wounds, exhaustion, and fear. The psychological pressure was immense. The constant awareness of death, in battle, by shipwreck, from disease, from execution if captured, was a heavy burden. The Vikings developed a complex belief system to cope with this, centered on the Norse gods. Odin, the Allfather, god of war and wisdom, who gathered slain warriors to Valhalla. Thor, the Thunderer, protector of mankind. Freya, goddess of love and war, who also received half the slain in her hall. Folkvanger, belief in an afterlife, especially a glorious one in Valhalla for those who died bravely, provided comfort and motivation. The concept of word or fate was also central. The idea that one's destiny was largely predetermined, but facing it with courage was paramount. This belief system helped them rationalize the violence and death that surrounded them, giving meaning to their struggles and sacrifices. You, with your diverse modern beliefs or lack thereof, would find the Viking worldview, with its acceptance of violence as a path to honor and its fatalistic embrace of a brutal fate, alien and disturbing. The mental fortitude required to face constant violence and death, sustained only by a belief in a warrior's paradise, is beyond the experience of most people today. Returning home, if they were lucky, was not the end of the ordeal. The voyage back was as perilous as the voyage out. Storms, enemies, and accidents could still claim them. And upon return, the spoils had to be divided. The chieftain who led the raid took the largest share, as was his right. His closest warriors and ship captains received generous portions. The common crewman got a smaller, but still potentially life-changing share of silver or goods. This wealth could lift a man and his family out of subsistence poverty. It could buy better land, more livestock, finer tools, or even a wife. But it could also breed jealousy and conflict within the community. The returned raider was changed. He had seen the wider world, experienced extremes of violence and wealth, and faced death. Reintegrating into the slow, grinding rhythm of farm life must have been difficult. The memories of battle, the faces of the slain, the horrors witnessed, would linger. There was no therapy, no counseling. Men were expected to bear their burdens, silently, to be tough. The trauma of violence was internalized, perhaps manifesting as aggression, withdrawal, or heavy drinking. Ale was a constant. You, who have access to mental health support and live in a society that, increasingly, acknowledges trauma, cannot imagine the isolation and silent suffering of a Viking warrior haunted by his experiences, with no outlet, but perhaps more violence. Or the bottom of a drinking horn knot, so, the life beyond the farmstead. The raiding, trading, exploring was not a glamorous adventure. It was a high-stakes gamble with survival as the only prize for most. It demanded incredible physical strength, endurance, and fighting skill. It required navigating treacherous seas, facing unknown dangers, and inflicting or witnessing horrific violence. It was built upon the same foundation of hardship as farm life, but amplified by the constant, immediate threat of a violent death. The steel of the Viking axe was forged in fire. The steel of the Viking spirit was forged in this crucible of extreme hardship, danger, and brutality. You, who live a life of relative comfort, safety, and ease, would not survive the journey, let alone the raid or the battle. The sheer physical demands, the psychological terror, the visceral horror of close combat. These are things your modern existence has not prepared you for. You wouldn't survive a day as a Viking raider. You wouldn't survive the first hour. At sea, the first clash of shields, the first sight of the carnage you were capable of creating. The Viking warrior was a product of his harsh world, forged in ways you cannot comprehend. But even this life of action and violence was ultimately transient. The seasons turned, the raids ended, the trader returned home. The long, dark Scandinavian winter awaited, demanding the same relentless grind for survival as always. The warrior had to become the farmer again, the axe traded for the plowshare, until the call of the sea and the promise of plunder, or the need for trade, drew him out once more. This cycle of grinding toil and explosive violence defined the Viking Age. It was a life of extremes, a life you could not endure. The relentless physical hardship, the constant threat of violence, the omnipresence of death, these realities of Viking life could not be borne by muscle and endurance alone. The human spirit, even one forged as tough as the Vikings, needed something more. It needed meaning, explanation, solace, and a framework to understand the seemingly random cruelties of existence. This need was met by a complex and powerful belief system, a rich tapestry woven from Norse mythology, animistic traditions, and a profound sense of fate. This worldview permeated every aspect of Viking life, from the highest ritual to the most mundane daily act, providing a structure for understanding the world and their place within it. You, living in an age of science and diverse spiritual options, might find these beliefs primitive or fantastical, but for the Vikings, they were as real and essential as the air they breathed and the ground they stood upon. To understand the Viking, you must understand the gods they feared and revered, the fate they accepted, and the unseen world they navigated daily. At the heart of Norse cosmology lay Yggdrasil, the immense world ash tree, its colossal trunk pierced. The cosmos, its roots delving deep into the mysterious realms below, and its branches reaching up towards the distant heavens. Yggdrasil connected the 9 worlds, each inhabited by different beings. Midgard, the middle world, was the realm of humanity, surrounded by the impassable ocean. Above lay Asgard, the fortress home of the Aesir gods, Odin, Thor, and others. Linked to Midgard by the shimmering Bifrost, the Rainbow Bridge. Below Midgard lay Niflheim, a world of ice and mist, and Hel, the realm of the dead, ruled by the goddess Hel. Jotunheim, the land of the giants, Jotnar, was a wild, chaotic realm often in conflict with the gods. Alfheim was home to the light elves, Svartalfheim to the dark elves, dwarves, Vanaheim to the Vanir gods, associated with fertility, like Freyr and Freya, and Muspelheim, a primordial world of fire, guarded by the fire giant Surtur. This intricate structure wasn't just mythology. It was their map of reality. Every mountain, forest, and spring was believed to be inhabited by spirits. Landvedir, land spirits, Disir, female ancestral spirits, Holderfolk, hidden people. The world was alive, pulsing with unseen forces and intelligences. You, who view the world through a scientific lens, might dismiss this as superstition, but for the Vikings, it was a lived reality. Every journey required placating the local land vetter with offerings. Every important decision might involve consulting the spirits or the gods. The boundary between the seen and unseen was thin and permeable. You would find this constant awareness of and interaction with a spirit world unsettling and mentally taxing. The gods themselves were not distant, benevolent figures. They were powerful, capricious, and very much involved in the affairs of humans and the cosmos. They were reflections of the Viking world itself, powerful, prone to conflict, bound by fate, and ultimately mortal. Odin, the All-Father, was the most complex and feared. He was the god of war, wisdom, poetry, magic, and the dead. He was a seeker of knowledge, sacrificing his eye to drink from Mimir's well of wisdom and hanging himself for 9 nights on Yggdrasil to gain the secrets of the runes. He was the leader of the Aesir, but also a shapeshifter and a master of cider, a form of magic often associated with women. He was terrifying, inspiring awe and dread. He gathered the Einherjar, the spirits of warriors slain in battle, to his hall, Valhalla, where they feasted and fought each day in preparation for Ragnarok, the final battle at the end of the world. To die in battle was the ultimate honor, a direct ticket to Odin's hall. Thor, Odin's son, was far more popular with the common folk. He was the god of thunder, strength, and the protector of Midgard against the giants. Wielding his mighty hammer Mjolnir, which always returned to his hand and could level mountains, Thor was the ultimate defender. He was straightforward, strong, and relatable, the god you prayed to for protection, for good harvests, for safe travel. His hammer amulets were among the most common Viking finds, worn for protection and blessing. Freyja, the Vanir goddess, was equally powerful. She was the goddess of love, beauty, fertility, but also war and death. She received half of the slain warriors in her hall, Folkvanger. She was a practitioner of cider and owned the necklace Besingamen. She embodied the duality of life and death, creation and destruction. Loki, the trickster god, was a constant source of trouble. A Jotun by blood, he lived among the Aesir, often causing chaos through his cunning and deceit, but sometimes helping them out of trouble. He was the father of monstrous beings, the wolf Fenrir, the serpent Jormungandr, who encircled Midgard, and Hel, the goddess of the dead. Loki represented chaos, the unpredictable element that could disrupt even the gods' plans. You, who might pray to a single, all-powerful, benevolent god, would find the Norse pantheon confusing and morally ambiguous. These gods fought, lied, cheated, and died. They demanded sacrifice, sometimes human, and offered no guarantees of salvation. They were forces of nature and personifications of human traits, not moral guides. Interacting with them required caution, respect, and offerings, not blind faith, the concept of fate or word, Old Norse. Was perhaps the most powerful and pervasive belief. The Norns, 3 powerful female beings, Urd, Verdandi, and Skuld, who lived by the well of Urd beneath Yggdrasil, were believed to weave the destiny of every being, god or mortal. Their decree was absolute. Nothing could change the course of Urd. This belief was not fatalistic in the sense of encouraging passivity. Rather, it emphasized that how one met one's fate was what mattered. Courage, honor, and resilience in the face of an inevitable destiny were paramount. A warrior knew he might die in battle, but he fought fiercely anyway, meeting his fate with bravery. A farmer knew a harsh winter might come, but he worked tirelessly to prepare, facing his fate with fortitude. Word provided a framework for accepting suffering and death. It wasn't random cruelty. It was the working out of a cosmic pattern. This acceptance could be a source of immense strength, allowing individuals to face incredible hardship without breaking. You who believe in free will and the power to shape your own destiny would find the Viking acceptance of an unchangeable fate deeply unsettling. It removes the illusion of control, demanding instead a focus on the quality of one's response to life's challenges, regardless of the outcome. It requires a different kind of courage, the courage to face what cannot be changed. This belief system manifested in daily life through rituals, sacrifices, and magic. Blots were sacrificial feasts held to honor the gods, spirits, or ancestors, usually at specific times of the year, like the winter solstice, Yule, or the start of the sailing season, or before important undertakings, like a raid or a voyage. Animals, cattle, horses, sheep, goats, pigs were the most common sacrifices. Their blood was collected in bowls and sprinkled on the participants and the altar with a twig, hlottin, a ritual known as blotting. The meat was then cooked and eaten in a communal feast, symbolically sharing the meal with the gods. In times of extreme crisis, famine, plague, or before a desperate battle, human sacrifice might occur, though archaeological evidence suggests it was relatively rare. The idea was to give the gods something valuable in return for their favor, or to appease their anger. Cider was a form of magic, often practiced by women, Valvis or sideconer, involving trance, prophecy, healing, and sometimes manipulating the forces of nature or fate. It was a powerful but potentially dangerous art, viewed with some suspicion by men. Runes, the ancient Germanic alphabet, were also believed to hold magical power. Carved onto objects, weapons, amulets, stones, they could offer protection, healing, victory, or even curse an enemy. Every Viking likely knew some simple rune spells. Magic wasn't fantasy. It was a practical tool for navigating the uncertainties of life. You who rely on science, medicine, and technology would find the reliance on sacrifice, prophecy, and magical symbols irrational and frightening. The idea of killing an animal to ensure a safe voyage, or carving symbols on a sword for protection, seems primitive, but for the Vikings, it was a rational response, a world they perceived as governed by unseen forces and capricious deities. Death and the afterlife were central concerns. As mentioned, a glorious death in battle meant Valhalla for Odin or Folkvanger for Freya, eternal, feasting and fighting in preparation for Ragnarok. This was the ideal, the warrior's paradise. But most people didn't die in battle. What happened to them? The belief was complex. The dead could go to hell, a realm not necessarily a place of eternal torment like the Christian hell, but a gloomy, misty underworld where the dead continued, a shadowy existence. Some might be reborn into their family line. Others might dwell in their burial mounds, becoming powerful ancestral spirits, Disir, who could protect or curse their descendants. Burial practices reflected these beliefs. The wealthy were often buried in ships or ship-shaped settings, surrounded by grave goods, weapons, tools, jewelry, food, drink, even sacrificed animals, or sometimes human retainers, wives or thralls, to equip them for the afterlife journey. The famous Oseberg and Gokstad ship burials in Norway are spectacular examples. Cremation was also common, especially earlier in the period, perhaps reflecting a belief that fire released the spirit. Grave goods were essential. The dead needed their possessions in the next world. You, who view death as a biological end or a transition to a spiritual realm defined by your faith, would find the Viking conception of the afterlife fragmented and materialistic. The idea of being buried with your sword or your cooking pot, or of your spirit lingering in a mound, speaks to a worldview where the physical and spiritual were deeply intertwined, and death was not an end, but a transformation requiring preparation. Ragnarok. The twilight of the gods was the ultimate expression of this belief system. It was a prophesied apocalypse, a final battle where the forces of chaos, led by Loki and his monstrous children, the giants and the denizens of Muspelheim, would destroy the gods and the world. Odin would be swallowed by Fenrir. Thor would slay Jormungandr, but die from its venom. Heimdall and Loki would kill each other. Surtur would burn the world with his flaming sword. Yet even in this cataclysm, there was hope. A new world, green and fertile, would rise from the waters. A few gods, Odin's sons Vidar and Vali, Thor's sons Modi and Magni, and two humans, Leif and Lifthrasir, who hid in Yggdrasil, would survive. To repopulate it, Ragnarok was not just an end. It was a cycle of destruction and rebirth. It reflected the Viking awareness of the impermanence of all things, gods, men, worlds, but also the resilience of life itself. It gave meaning to suffering and death, framing them as part of a larger, inevitable cosmic drama. You, who live in a world largely free from apocalyptic fears, despite modern anxieties, would find the Viking acceptance of an inevitable divinely ordained end to their world profoundly bleak. Yet for them, it was a truth that shaped their understanding of existence, emphasizing the importance of living bravely and honorably in the face of inevitable doom. So, the Viking world was alive, with meaning, thick with gods, spirits, fate, and magic. It provided explanations for storms, Thor's anger, for crop failure, displeased gods or spirits, for victory in battle, Odin's favor or word, for illness, the work of elves or curses. It offered solace in grief. The dead lived on in Hell or Valhalla, or as protective ancestors. It demanded courage in the face of death. Meet your word with honor. It structured the year with festivals and sacrifices. It permeated art, poetry, and law. It was the invisible architecture supporting the harsh, visible reality of their lives. You, stepping into this worldview, would find it overwhelming. The constant need to be mindful of spirits, the fear of offending capricious gods, the acceptance of an unchangeable fate, the ever-present shadow of Ragnarok. These would create a psychological burden you are unprepared for. Your rational mind would struggle against the perceived irrationality. Your sense of control would shatter against the immovable rock of word. The Viking belief system was not a comfort. It was a demanding framework for navigating a perilous and uncertain existence. It required constant engagement, constant respect, and constant courage. It was as much a part of their survival as their axes and their longships. Without it, the relentless hardship and violence would have been unbearable. With it, they found the strength to endure, to explore, to fight, and to live fiercely in a world they knew was destined to end. You wouldn't survive a day in their physical world. You certainly wouldn't survive a day in their spiritual one. The whispers of the unknown were loud and constant in the Viking mind, a chorus they lived by, and a chorus you could not bear to hear. The individual Viking, forged by hardship, violence, and a complex spiritual worldview, did not exist in isolation. They were enmeshed in a tightly woven fabric of society, a structure defined by kinship, bound by law, and sustained by the weight of community expectations. This social fabric was both a source of strength and a potential source of conflict. It provided protection, identity, and a framework for resolving disputes, but it also imposed obligations, hierarchies, and the constant pressure of social judgment. You, living in a large, anonymous, individualistic modern society, would find the Viking social structure claustrophobic, demanding, and often brutally unforgiving. Let us examine the threads that held Viking society together, the bonds of blood, the letter of the law, and the unyielding gaze of the community. Kinship was the absolute bedrock. Your identity, your status, your security, and your obligations. were first and foremost defined by your family, your immediate household, your extended clan, jate, and your ancestors. Loyalty to kin was paramount, often superseding loyalty to a chieftain or even the law. The family was the primary economic unit. Working the land together, it was the primary military unit. Feuds were fought between families, not just individuals. It was the primary social unit. Marriages were alliances between families, designed to strengthen bonds, secure land, or resolve feuds. Disputes within the family were handled internally whenever possible, to avoid shame and external interference. The honor of the family, Orster, was a collective concern. An insult to one member was an insult to all. A crime committed by one member brought shame upon the entire lineage. Conversely, the achievements and fame of one member brought honor to all. This created an immense pressure to conform, to uphold the family's reputation. You, who value personal autonomy and can choose your friends and associates freely, would find the suffocating embrace of Viking kinship unbearable. Your life would not be your own. It would belong to your family. Your choices, whom to marry, what work to do, where to live, even whom to fight, would be dictated by the needs and honor of your kin. Defying your family could mean ostracism, loss of protection, and social death. At the head of the family stood the patriarch, usually the eldest male, the husbandi, householder, or gogi, chieftain, if he held that status. He held significant authority. He managed the farm's resources, represented the family in legal matters, arranged marriages for his children, and was responsible for the family's safety and honor. His word was law within the household. Wives held considerable influence and responsibility, managing the domestic sphere, the finances, and the workforce, including thralls, but ultimate formal authority rested with the husband. Children were expected to obey absolutely. Disobedience could be punished severely. The family was a hierarchy, not a democracy. You, accustomed to egalitarian relationships within families and the protection of individual rights, would find this patriarchal structure oppressive. The lack of personal freedom, especially for women and children, would be deeply frustrating. Beyond the immediate family, the clan, JT, provided a wider network of support and obligation. Clans traced their lineage back to a common ancestor, often a semi-legendary figure. Members of the same JT were expected to support each other in disputes, contribute to blood money payments, Wurgeld, if a member killed someone, and rally together if the clan was threatened. This bond could extend over large areas. However, clans could also be bitter rivals, feuding for generations over land, insults, or killings. Blood feuds were a terrifying reality of Viking society. If a member of your Jate killed someone from another JT, the victim's family was obligated to seek revenge by killing a member of your family. This cycle of vengeance could spiral out of control, engulfing entire communities for decades. The only way to stop it was through negotiation, often involving the payment of Wurgeld, man price, a substantial sum of money or goods, paid by the killer's family to the victim's family as compensation. The amount varied depending on the victim's social status. Wurgeld was a crucial legal concept, providing an alternative to endless bloodshed, but it required both parties to accept it. Pride and the need for vengeance often made this difficult. You, who live under a state monopoly on violence and rely on police and courts for justice, would find the Viking system of kin-based justice and blood feuds terrifying. A minor dispute could escalate into a deadly conflict involving your entire extended family. The constant threat of retaliation, the need to always be vigilant, the weight of knowing your actions could doom your relatives. This would create a state of perpetual anxiety you are unprepared for. However, was not absent. Viking society, particularly in Iceland, where a remarkable system developed, placed a high value on law as a means of regulating society and preventing chaos. Things were regional assemblies held periodically, usually at a central, often sacred site. Here, free men and sometimes influential women gathered. They heard lawsuits, passed judgments, announced new laws, and conducted religious rituals. The most famous was the Althing in Iceland, established around 930 AD, considered one of the world's first parliaments. At the thing, law speakers, liskskumur, recited the laws from memory, a prodigious feat. Cases were argued by the parties involved, or their representatives, often skilled orators. Juries of local men were impaneled to deliver verdicts. The judgments were based on customary law, precedent, and the arguments presented. There was no king or state executive to enforce the judgments. Enforcement relied entirely on the community. If someone was found guilty and refused to pay the imposed fine or compensation, they could be declared an outlaw, skogarmir, man of the woods. Being outlawed was the most severe punishment. It meant losing all legal protection. Anyone could kill you without consequence. You were banished from society, forced to live in the wilderness, utterly alone and vulnerable. It was effectively a death sentence. The power of the thing lay in the community's collective will to uphold its decisions and the ultimate sanction of outlawry. You, who take the existence of a professional police force and a functioning court system for granted, would find the Viking legal system fascinating but fragile. Its effectiveness depended entirely on social cohesion and the willingness of individuals to enforce judgments themselves. The fear of being declared an outlaw was a powerful deterrent, but the system was vulnerable to powerful chieftains manipulating it, or to communities failing to unite against a lawbreaker. The lack of a central enforcement authority would feel insecure and chaotic. Social hierarchy was rigid and pervasive. At the top were the kings and great chieftains, jarls Höfdingar. They controlled large tracts of land, commanded warbands, accumulated wealth through tribute and trade, and wielded significant political power. Their status was maintained by their ability to reward followers with gifts of gold, silver, weapons, and land. Generosity was a key kingly virtue. A stingy ruler would lose followers. Below them were the free farmers, bondi, carler. They formed the backbone of society. They owned or leased land, were armed, and had full legal rights at the thing. They were the warriors, the shipbuilders, the traders. While not wealthy, they were independent and respected. Below them were the landless freemen, perhaps craftsmen, tenant farmers, or sailors who owned no land. They had legal rights but were economically vulnerable. At the very bottom were the thralls, thrallar, slaves. They had no rights, no property, no legal protection. They were chattel, bought, and sold like animals. They performed the hardest, earliest work: farming, mining, construction, domestic service. They could be beaten, maimed, or killed by their owners with impunity, though killing another man's thrall required compensation. Children born to thralls were themselves thralls. Manumission, freeing a thrall, was possible but not common. The existence of thralls was fundamental to the Viking economy, providing the labor force that allowed free men to pursue raiding, trading, and other activities. You living in a society that officially rejects slavery and values, at least in principle, social equality, would find the Viking class system, particularly the brutal reality of thraldom, morally repugnant. The casual acceptance of human beings as property, the vast gulf between the life of a jarl and the life of a thrall. The rigid barriers to social mobility, though a successful raider could rise, would clash violently with your modern values. Community life was intense and judgmental. Everyone knew everyone else's business. Reputation, Orster, was everything. Your standing in the community depended on your perceived honor, courage, generosity, reliability, and adherence to social norms. Gossip was a powerful social control mechanism. A whispered accusation of cowardice, theft, or sexual impropriety could ruin your reputation, making it hard to find allies, arrange marriages, or conduct business. Public shaming was a common punishment for lesser crimes. Hospitality was a sacred duty. Turning away a traveler, especially in harsh weather, brought shame and could anger the gods. Generosity was expected from those with means. Hoarding wealth was frowned upon. Festivals and gatherings, like the blots or feasts held by chieftains, were crucial for reinforcing social bonds, displaying status, and resolving disputes in a more informal setting. These were loud, boisterous affairs involving vast quantities of ale and mead, storytelling, poetry recitals, games, and sometimes violence. You who value privacy and individual expression would find the constant scrutiny and pressure to conform. In Viking community life suffocating. The lack of anonymity, the fear of social disgrace, the obligation to participate in communal rituals and feuds, the weight of constantly managing your reputation, this would create a level of social stress you have never experienced. Your modern concept of minding your own business would be seen as antisocial and suspicious. Women, while legally subordinate to men, under the guardianship of their father or husband, Mund, held significant practical power and responsibility, especially within the household and the family. As discussed earlier, they managed the farm's economy, the workforce, and the domestic sphere. They could own property, inherit land, though usually less than brothers, and initiate divorce proceedings. A relatively simple process requiring witnesses. A woman's honor was fiercely guarded. Sexual misconduct by a wife could bring shame upon the entire family. Some women, particularly the seeresses vulvas, who practiced cider, wielded considerable spiritual influence. There are also accounts of legendary shield maidens who fought alongside men, though their historical prevalence is debated. While not equal to men in formal legal status, Viking women were far from powerless figures confined to the home. They were essential partners in the economic and social survival of the family. You, accustomed to legal gender equality and a wide range of life choices, would find the limitations placed on Viking women, their legal subordination, the focus on their role within the family, the intense scrutiny of their sexual behavior, restrictive and unfair. However, you might also recognize the immense practical authority they wielded within their sphere. So, Viking society was a complex web. It offered protection through kinship and community, justice through the thing and the threat of outlawry, and structure through rigid hierarchy. It demanded loyalty to family above all, adherence to law and custom, and constant vigilance in maintaining one's reputation. It was a society built for survival in a harsh world, where cooperation was essential, but conflict was never far beneath the surface. The bonds of kinship could be a shield or a stranglehold. The law could provide justice or be manipulated by the powerful. The community could offer support or crush an individual with judgment. You, stepping into this world, would be adrift. You have no kin network to protect you. You don't understand the intricate laws and customs. You have no established reputation. Your modern individualism would be seen as selfish and dangerous. Your ignorance of social obligations would mark you as untrustworthy. You would be vulnerable to exploitation, unable to navigate the complex alliances and feuds, and likely to run afoul of the law or the unwritten codes of honor. The weight of community expectations, the constant need to prove your worth and loyalty, the fear of social death through disgrace or outlawry, these pressures would be immense. You wouldn't survive a day in Viking society? You wouldn't survive an hour at the thing, a minute in a blood feud, or a single feast under the watchful eyes of the community. The fabric of Viking society was strong, but it was woven with threads of obligation, hierarchy, and potential violence that would entangle and strangle you. It was a world where belonging was essential for survival, but belonging came at a steep price you could not pay. The Viking Age, like all things in the Norse cosmos, was not destined to last forever. The forces that had driven the Scandinavians outwards, population pressure, the desire for wealth, the thirst for adventure, began to shift. The world they encountered began to change, and Scandinavia itself began to transform. The long twilight of the Viking era was a period of transition, decline, and ultimately absorption into the broader tapestry of medieval Europe. The echoes of their world, however, still resonate, not in the romanticized image of the horn-helmeted warrior, but in the stark realities of their existence, the resilience forged in hardship, the impact of their exploration and violence, and the enduring questions their way of life raises about survival, community, and the human spirit. You, living in the comfortable aftermath of their world, can look back, but you can never truly know the cold, the hunger, the fear, or the fierce, desperate vitality that defined them. Let us consider their passing and the legacy they left behind. Decline of the Viking Age was gradual, driven by a confluence of internal and external factors. Internally, Scandinavia was undergoing significant changes. The centuries of raiding and trading had brought immense wealth, particularly in silver, back to the homelands. This wealth allowed powerful chieftains to consolidate their power, accumulate more land, and build stronger fortifications. The old, relatively egalitarian society of free farmers began to give way to a more feudal structure, with powerful kings emerging in Denmark, Harald Bluetooth, Norway, Harald Fairhair, and later Sweden. These centralizing monarchies sought to control the raiding and trading activities for their own benefit, and to establish law and order within their realms. The independent spirit of the Viking warrior and the local power of the Thing were increasingly challenged by royal authority. Christianity, which had been making inroads for centuries, was formally adopted as the state religion in Denmark around 965 AD, in Norway around 995 AD, and in Sweden around 1008 AD. This was a monumental shift. Conversion was often top-down, driven by kings who saw political advantages in allying with the powerful Christian Church of Rome and accessing its European networks. Missionaries, sometimes peacefully, sometimes backed by force, worked to eradicate the old pagan beliefs. The old gods, Thor, Odin, Freya, were supplanted by Christ. The great temples and sacred groves were destroyed or abandoned. The rituals, sacrifices, and magical practices that had structured Viking life were condemned as devil worship. This religious transformation fundamentally altered the worldview. The acceptance of a single, all-powerful, benevolent God replaced the complex, often capricious pantheon. The concept of an eternal heaven or hell replaced Valhalla, hell, and the cyclical Ragnarok. The Church brought new laws, new social norms, particularly regarding marriage and sexuality, and new centers of power in the form of monasteries and bishoprics. The old way of life, intertwined with paganism, was systematically dismantled. You, who likely live in a culturally Christian or post-Christian society, might see this as progress, but for the Vikings, it was the end of their world, the death of their gods, and the loss of a fundamental part of their identity. The psychological and cultural upheaval must have been immense. Externally, the world the Vikings had raided and traded in was no longer as vulnerable or as profitable. The targets of their early raids, monasteries, and poorly defended coastal villages, learned. Defenses improved. Kings like Alfred the Great in England built navies and fortified towns, making raids more costly and dangerous. The Frankish Empire developed better coastal defenses. The Caliphate in the east, once a source of vast silver wealth through trade. Routes like the Volga declined and fragmented. The easy pickings were gone. Furthermore, the Vikings themselves began to settle in the lands they had conquered or explored. The Danelaw in England, Normandy in France, the settlements in Ireland, Scotland, the Isles, Iceland, Greenland, and even briefly North America, these became new homes. Settling down meant shifting from a life of raiding and exploration to one of farming, trading, and integrating, often violently, with local populations. The descendants of raiders became farmers, merchants, and eventually nobles in their new homelands. The distinct Viking identity began to blur as they intermarried, adopted local languages and customs, and converted to Christianity. In places like Normandy, the Viking settlers became the Normans, eventually conquering England themselves in 1066, an event often seen as marking the definitive end of the Viking Age. The great exploratory voyages also dwindled. The Greenland settlements struggled and ultimately vanished in the 15th century, likely due to climate change and isolation. Contact with North America was not sustained. The impetus for outward expansion faded as opportunities at home changed, and abroad diminished. The last great Viking figure is often considered to be Harald Hardrada, Harold Sigurdsson, the Norwegian king who died in 1066 while invading England, famously defeated by King Harold Godwinson at Stamford Bridge, just days before William the Conqueror's Norman invasion. Harold was a true throwback, a formidable warrior who had served in the Varangian Guard in Constantinople, amassed great wealth, and dreamed of conquering England. His death marked the end of an era. After 1066, large-scale Viking raids from Scandinavia effectively ceased. The age of the dragon ships and the berserker rage was over. Scandinavia turned inward, becoming part of the medieval Christian world. The longships were replaced by different types of vessels more suited for trade under royal charter. The warriors became subjects of kings and soldiers in royal armies. The old ways faded into memory, then into legend. What legacy did this harsh, vibrant, and ultimately transient world leave? It is complex and often misunderstood. The popular image of the Viking, the horned helmet, a myth invented much later, the mindless barbarians sacking monasteries, is a caricature. The reality was far more nuanced. Their impact was profound and widespread. Geographically, their exploration expanded the known world. They were the first Europeans to reach North America, centuries before Columbus. They settled Iceland, creating a unique society with a remarkable literary tradition, the Sagas. They established trade routes that stretched from Newfoundland to Baghdad, acting as connectors between disparate cultures. They founded cities like Dublin in Ireland and Kiev in Russia, though the origins of the Russian state are complex. Their presence shaped the political and linguistic landscape of the British Isles, France, and Russia. Culturally, their legacy is mixed but significant. Their art, intricate wood carvings, metalwork, brooches, pendants, weapons, and runestone, displays a distinctive style characterized by interlacing patterns and animal motifs. Their literature, particularly the Icelandic sagas written down in the 13th century, but preserving oral traditions from the Viking Age, offers unparalleled insights into their mindset, values, and daily life. The feuds, the voyages, the family dramas, the blend of realism and the supernatural. The Old Norse language they spoke is the ancestor of modern Scandinavian languages, Danish, Norwegian, Swedish, Icelandic, and has left a significant mark on English, with words like sky, skin, leg, window, husband, wife, law, die, knife, and even Thursday, Thor's Day, and Friday, Freya's Day, deriving from Old Norse. Their legal traditions, particularly the Icelandic system, influenced later concepts of democracy and common law. Their reputation for violence is undeniable, but it must be contextualized. They were no more brutal than many other contemporary peoples, including the Franks, the Anglo-Saxons, or the various Irish kingdoms. Their raids were shocking to Christian chroniclers, precisely because they targeted churches, but warfare was endemic in the early Middle Ages. Their legacy of violence is intertwined with their legacy of exploration, trade, and cultural exchange. They were both destroyers and creators, raiders and settlers, pagans and, eventually, Christians. But perhaps the most enduring legacy, the one that speaks most directly to the core of their experience, is the legacy of resilience. The Vikings emerged from one of the most challenging environments in Europe. They endured a climate that was actively hostile, a landscape that was difficult to farm, and a constant threat of starvation. They built sophisticated ships that mastered the treacherous North Atlantic. They established trade networks across vast distances. They created complex societies with legal systems and cultural traditions. They faced death in battle by shipwreck, from disease, from the elements, with a courage born of necessity and shaped by their belief in fate and the afterlife. They were not supermen. They were ordinary humans pushed to extraordinary limits by their world. Their story is a testament to the incredible adaptability and endurance of the human spirit when, faced with overwhelming adversity, they remind us that civilization is not built in comfort, but often forged in hardship. You, listening to this tale of the hard life of the Vikings, safe in your warm, well-lit room, with food readily available and danger distant, might feel a sense of relief. You are glad you do not live in that world. You are glad you do not face the cold, the hunger, the constant threat of violence, the loss of children, the backbreaking labor, the suffocating social pressures, the fear of the gods, and the certainty of a harsh fate. You wouldn't survive a day, and that is true. The physical and psychological demands of Viking life are beyond the experience of most modern humans. We are softened by comfort, shielded by technology, protected by systems they could never imagine. But perhaps there is also a flicker of something else, a grudging respect for their toughness, a recognition that beneath the violence and the hardship, there was a vitality, a connection to the natural world, a sense of community and shared fate that is often missing in our fragmented, individualistic, modern lives. They lived intensely, aware of death, bound by kin, driven by ambition and necessity. Their world was smaller, harsher, but perhaps more immediate, more real. Their gods walked among them. Their fate was woven. Their honor was life. Itself, the long twilight of the Viking Age settled over Scandinavia centuries ago. The long ships rot, the runestones weather, the sagas are read in quiet libraries. The cold, the hunger, the fear, the fury, these have faded into history, but the echoes remain. In the languages we speak, the lands we inhabit, the stories we tell, and in the deep, often unacknowledged, recognition that human beings are capable of enduring almost unimaginable hardship. The Vikings are gone, but the hard life they lived, the life you wouldn't survive a day in, continues to cast a long shadow over our understanding of the past, and perhaps over our understanding of ourselves. The wind still howls down the fjords, the sea still crashes on the rocky shores, and somewhere in the collective memory, the ghost of a dragon ship still sails on a cold, gray sea, a reminder of a time when survival was the only victory, and life was a battle fought every single day. Sleep now and dream of warmer, safer shores. The Viking world is done. Let its echoes fade into the long night.